Hi everyone, welcome back to lecture 1 of week 9. I hope you're all having a great day and staying safe and inside and not going anywhere unless you essentially need to do that. Okay, so I'm going to start today's lecture with just a brief review of what we did last week. So we covered quite a lot last week. One of the mainly we were focusing on gender diversity in the workplace in terms of the last lecture. And we explored the role of workforce and family policies in the workplace and why they had to come about. And so one of the reasons they came about was because when women entered the workforce, there started to be a lot of absenteeism from both men and females around having to leave to deal with family issues or care for children, that kind of thing, at different points. And the workplace wasn't being a very productive place. So to deal with that, they had to start thinking, how do we make the workplace a place where people can balance their responsibilities of the work that they're doing with the responsibilities of their life outside of work. And so that's where workforce and family policy sort of came into place. We talked about things about like sick leave and getting 4 weeks annual leave, carers leave. So we talked about how all these sorts of things came into place to pretty much balance our work life with our personal lives. We also talked about the barriers that women face in the workforce, and some of those barriers were things like having to take time out from their career to raise children and what the impacts of that were. So some of the impacts of that included things like not being able to progress into more leadership roles because of the gaps in their career. Financially, they would be less better off in the long run because, like for example, in Australia, we have superannuation, which is pretty much the income that you'll have when you retire, and our work employment contributes to that. Now, if you have to take time out of your job for a year or 2 or 3, then you miss out on those superannuation contributions and therefore end up financially worse off than, say, men, for example. We talked about different strategies to overcome workplace inclusion issues for women. We talked about issues around discrimination against people who may be pregnant or take leave and how that's against the law. We talked about the need to address unconscious bias, especially when women are working in industries that are seen as masculine. For example, if you look at a job like a tradie, the tradies like plumbers and people that build builders and that kind of thing, it's not normally an industry that you would expect women to be in, even though there are women that work in those industries. But they're less likely to get a leadership role in those because they're not necessarily seen as the norm to be there, if that makes sense. So we talked about masculine and feminine type industries, and we'll talk about that more in the tutorial. We talked about different gender identity and different terms and I guess labels that different people use and identify with. And we talked about how gender is really a spectrum. It's not just male and female, this binary idea. It's actually a much broader spectrum than that. And we also explored the history around gender diversity and why it's not a new thing, even though it feels a new thing, because for a long period of time, the dominant culture around gender has been this binary notion of male, female, and your sexual orientation is male, the heterosexual, which is attractions between male and females and males towards each other. We talked about the difference between transgender and a transsexual person. So we talked about, just as an example of one of the terms that we explored, so for example, a transgender person is someone who, for example, may be male but like to dress up every now and then as a female, but most of the time is happy to accept and identifies their gender as being male. Whereas a transsexual person is someone, for example, who may be born female but feels their gender identity is male, and they don't want to just be pretend to dress up as a male every now and then. They want to be a male full time in their lives. And so A transsexual person will often may undergo surgery to turn themselves into a male, or hormonal therapies and stuff like that. Or they may not. They may just, the gender expression may just be that of a male. We talked about the barriers that LGBTQI people face in the workplace. A big part of that was discrimination and the need to have to hide your gender identity and expression in the workplace, and the mental health impacts of that. And we talked about some of the strategies to overcome that, which was looking at addressing discrimination, building awareness around what gender diversity is, ensuring that the environment, the physical environment of a workplace is, evident of inclusion. For example, toilets are normally a big one. Like you may just have gender neutral toilets instead of having male-female toilets in the workplace, that kind of thing. We talked about why it's important for LGBTQI people to be in the workplace, and that's quite easy. It's because they are a part of our population and they have contributions to make just like everybody else. But today we're going to focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the workplace, the barriers they face and the barriers and how to address those barriers. We're also going to explore introduction to diversity management framework. So how do organisations who don't have a diversity and inclusion plan, how do they go about starting one? And if you were in an organisation that didn't have one, how do you create one? What's the framework you use to do that? And we're also going to explore Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reconciliation frameworks and plans. And a part of that is because they're quite common in addressing some of the workplace barriers and barriers in society more broadly, and they're quite common in community service organisations around the country. So it'd be good for you to know about them. But first of all, who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? So this here is a map of what Australia looked like before colonisation and what Australia still looks like based on Indigenous perspectives today. So the term Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander isn't something that I guess Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people call themselves. So for example, yes, I'm an Aboriginal person, but I identify as a Yorta Yorta woman, which Yorta Yorta's down here somewhere. And that's because that was my language group. That was my tribal area that my historical connections are to. So the word Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander really was a word that was given by the colonisers to explain who the First Nations people were, or who the people were before colonisation happened. And forgot what I was going to say. And my battery's running low. What's all happening here? So, back to that. So it's very easy to think that Aboriginal people, when people talk about Aboriginal people, that we're a homogenous group, that we're... Oh, why is this not working? Oh dear. That we're a homogenous group, that Aboriginal people are just one group of people. But we're not. We're many, many people, and very diverse peoples. And we have similar connections in terms of a lot of our spiritual worldviews and things like that. But there were a lot of differences in, for example, there were 250 languages that were spoken in Australia. There's still about 120, I think, that are still spoken fluently. Where I'm from, on Yorta Yorta country, there's a handful of people that speak it fluently, and there's a process of reclaiming language that's going on, and a lot of communities are doing that. So I really wanted to encourage you to make an effort to learn about the Indigenous perspectives of Australia. And this guide here is a really good one if you want to travel around when we're all allowed to travel again. This is a great guide and gives you a lot of information about the history. And it's important for you, not because I'm encouraging you to do this just because I think it's important, but because you're going to come in contact with Aboriginal clients, and our history in the country affects the dynamics within the work that we do. And so you have to be aware of those. Now, when it comes to Aboriginal people in the workforce, it's not good stats. We have the lowest rate of labour force participation and very high rates of unemployment. And out of all the groups that we normally look at for workforce inclusion, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most disadvantaged in that group in terms of workforce participation. Those of us that do have jobs are often earning lower incomes than non-Aboriginal population. And another example of that disparity is only 12% of Indigenous peoples own their own home compared to 40% of non-Indigenous population. So why is it like this? A big part of it is our history. There's been a cycle of exclusion and deprivation from the beginning. And a part of that would be like when Australia was colonised, a lot of Aboriginal people were put on mission settlements. The mission settlement that's where my family are all buried on is called Cumragunja. And this is where people were, they were given rations and taught the Bible and taught English and schooled on these missions and things. And if you wanted to go and work or to go off the mission, you needed to have permission. So we weren't really included in the society. We could go and work for different farmers or things like that. But again, it wasn't through our choice. If you wanted to be a doctor, for example, you couldn't just go off and be a doctor. Not in those days anyway. So there was a lot of stereotypes and myths that Aboriginal people are lazy and don't want to work. But the truth is, the idea and the concept of work pre-colonisation wasn't really there. Like, people had roles and responsibilities for the family and the community, but we didn't have this concept of work and employment. And because we weren't included in a part of the society at that time, and there was segregation, and then over time assimilation, there was this stereotype that we didn't want to work or that we were lazy, except a lot of people worked and a lot of people worked without getting paid. So let's have a little look at this. This is an example of, still today, is what's being rectified around stolen wages for Aboriginal people who did work historically.
The stolen wages issue has long been one of the key stumbling blocks in the way of reconciliation in this country. The term refers to the practice perpetrated by state and territory governments around the nation in years gone by, whereby Indigenous Australians worked for wages which they were never paid. From the late 1800s until as recently as the 1970s, Aborigines were sent out to work by the state. Their wages were supposed to go into trust funds, but over the decades that money had a disturbing habit of going missing within government accounts. 6 years ago, the New South Wales Government established the Aboriginal Trust Fund Repayment Scheme in order to set about returning unpaid money to its rightful owners. But as Stateline discovered, one of the Indigenous Australians who was a driving force behind the establishment of the scheme has now condemned it as a failure. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are warned that the following story may contain images of people who are no longer living. Nick Grimm reports.
So I worked as a slave labour in this country because that's what we was, slave labour.
Marjorie Woodrow, you've battled for years to see Indigenous Australians repaid their so-called stolen wages. At this point in time, how much satisfaction have you received from the scheme put in place by the New South Wales Government?
None at all.
Why not?
I'm very disappointed that I haven't been treated with more respect than from the government.
Aboriginal elder Marjorie Woodrow doesn't move as quickly as she once did, but the feisty 84-year-old promises she has plenty of fight left in her yet.
This has to be known by everyone what's been done to us in the past. You know, and I think that it's unfair if they think that we're going to take a small amount of money for the government to put it back under the carpet. It's been under the carpet too long. Didn't have carpets on the floor when we was here.
When Stateline last caught up with Marjorie Woodrow, she was one of a number of Aboriginal women making the difficult journey back to the now notorious Parramatta Girls' Home, where they had lived and suffered as teenagers.
I felt like hanging myself in there once. If I could have tore the blanket up, I would have done it.
But life outside institutions was often no less harsh. As a teenager, Marjorie Woodrow toiled 19-hour days on a remote property near Ningan in the state's central west. There were no holidays, and her wages were kept in trust by the state government and never paid. After years battling bureaucratic inertia to see Indigenous Australians repay their stolen wages, Marjorie Woodrow is angry that many are still waiting for justice.
And I'd imagine these would be fairly detailed records.
The irony for many victims making claims was that for decades government records had been poorly kept, lost, or were just plain non-existent. Marjorie Woodrow regarded herself as one of the lucky ones. Her file was brimming with information about the money she should have been earning for her work.
There's still a very long way to go before amends can be made in full.
Lawyer Vava Mawuli says thousands of other Indigenous Australians have come forward with their own stories of gross exploitation. On her books are cases like this woman's.
And this is her account of her experiences working for no wages. She says there was a lot of work to do for a child.
No one told us about wages or that we were supposed to get paid. The welfare put us out there and all we had to do was be little black slaves. I ran away from one employer where I was raped.
They didn't care what sort of condition we were in, whether we were sick or had an injury. You worked from dark in the morning to dark at night on a 7-day basis.
It says here, we worked and we worked our butts off. We were way too young to even function to do some of the tasks that were given to us.
That's right. That's a common experience with many claimants.
I reaffirm in this place, formally and solemnly as Premier, on behalf of the Government and people of New South Wales, our apology to the Aboriginal people.
In 1997, former Premier Bob Carr apologised to Indigenous Australians on behalf of his government and the people of New South Wales. But sorry wasn't enough in itself to make amends for past wrongs. In 2004, the Labor government established the Aboriginal Trust Fund Repayment Scheme. But for the claimants, their battle was not yet at an end.
I'm sorry that this has taken so long, but there is an absence of records.
When the scheme was first set up 6 years ago, it was estimated that it would cost the state up to $100 million. But so far, less than $2.5 million has been paid to claimants. Former Democrat Senator Aidan Ridgway is now the chairman of the panel overseeing the scheme. Are a lot of claimants, do they have unrealistic expectations of what they could have hoped to receive from the scheme?
Look, I think so, and I can understand why that would be the case. First of all, I think that the scheme itself has become mixed up somewhat with the stolen wages campaign and the need for compensation and justice at that national level. That's a campaign that we acknowledge and recognise. This is not a compensation scheme. What this is trying to do is to recognise that we have unpaid money sitting in trust fund accounts. We want to make sure that they're paid to the rightful people.
The state holds more than 5,500 individual trust funds. The problem for claimants was that often the money put in their trust funds in the first place was just a pittance, and even accounting for interest, the sums are still a relatively paltry amount. Aidan Ridgway says the solution was to offer every claimant a flat rate.
The lump sum payment was really about trying to deal with two things. One was about bringing a sense of equity and justice to the process. The other was about speeding up the process by which claims were made, so we could look at a simpler test being applied, rather than the merits-based approach, which went through all the documentation if they existed, in order to come up with some end outcome where people might only get a couple of $100 to a couple of $1,000.
But those who believe they're owed much more from the state government say they're being exploited once again.
I would be satisfied if they paid me what's owed to me. I'd be very happy with it. And at this stage, I need that money badly.
How much are we talking about?
Well, I think close to $1 million, I think.
And the New South Wales government offered you $12,000?
Yep. And I'm not satisfied with that.
There's concern too that the scheme isn't doing a good enough job of processing claims. Close to 9,000 have been lodged so far, and less than 400 have been finalised. With the scheme set to be closed by the state government at the end of this year, the Public Interest Advocacy Centre says time is fast running out.
The government ought to keep the scheme open and ensure that all of these claims are processed in a manner which is fair for claimants before it's shut.
Aidan Ridgway says the backlog of claims is nothing to be alarmed about.
We now no longer need to go to the extent of trying to identify how much sits in an account. All we need to do is establish that an account did exist on strong circumstantial evidence. Once we've done that, we can recommend a payment and that can be expedited immediately.
For many claimants too, old age is making memories fade and details become vague. But Marjorie Woodrow is vowing to fight on, saying she'll take legal action against the New South Wales government for what she believes she's owed.
I think that time's got to change for us to have something back to us, to give us something back in the right way that's owed to us gracefully.
Thanks, Nick Grimm.
So that was just, I guess, an example of some of the, I guess, complexity and discrimination that has taken place in the world of work from an Aboriginal perspective. Now, that didn't happen for every Aboriginal person, but it did happen for many, especially those who were removed from their families during the Stolen Generation era. So other barriers that exist for Aboriginal people include things like lower levels of education attainment, although this is changing, which means people who finish high school or go on to uni and get a degree, that kind of thing. For example, when I was at high school, I was the first Aboriginal person to finish high school at my school. And in the early years, I was one of the very early social workers that had been trained. Now, this is really changing. There's lots of Aboriginal social workers now. But that's changed. The change is coming, say, the last 15 years, we're seeing a real shift happening, but it's still very low. One of the other barriers that exist is health factors. Aboriginal people are more likely to die a lot earlier than non-Aboriginal people and face certain chronic health conditions such as diabetes, etc., that can affect workforce participation. There are also a lot of Aboriginal people that live in remote areas, and a lot of jobs are just not available in those areas. And even though most Aboriginal people live in urban or regional areas, if you take somewhere like the Northern Territory, there's a higher rate of Aboriginal people to non-Aboriginal people in certain areas, and that gives the impression that most Aboriginal people must live in these areas, but actually they live in urban centres, and those remote areas just don't have jobs available. And people don't want to move away from those towns because of their cultural connection and spiritual connections to land and country. So it's not as simple as saying just move to the city and get a job, because it's like a completely different country to move off yours to somewhere else. So some of the strategies that we need to address, I guess, more broadly in society. So when we were talking about gender diversity, we talked about how over time things have changed that allowing this shift to happen in the workplace for groups such as LGBTQI people who faced a lot of discrimination historically and still face discrimination, but how when things are changing in the society, things also change in the workplace in other ways. Now, in Australia, there's a whole lot of things that could be happening, such as, an example could be creating a treaty between Aboriginal people and the government of Australia. And we do have a treaty process underway in Victoria. So a treaty is pretty much an agreement between, you can actually have a look here, I'll take you to it, because it's quite exciting really. this is the treaty website, and this is about an agreement between state nations or governments, including an agreement between Indigenous people and governments. There's no set form way a treaty can have, but it's about trying to get a framework or a process and agreements in place to feel listened to and to create better opportunities as a nation as a whole, but also for our First Nations people to have a voice. So I have a little exploration of the treaty and how it can help the country and how it can affect change in a community. New Zealand, for example, is a place that has had treaty in place for a long time, and it's really amazing. Like, a lot of people are raised, the whole country is really raised with Maori traditions and language and country, and it has a really beautiful impact because it's not saying Aboriginal culture and languages, etc., just for Aboriginal people. It's a contribution. There's something to be shared with everybody here about Aboriginal people, about the country, and there's something we can all learn and can get contribution from. We've also talked about constitutional change. So when the Constitution was set up, it really excluded Aboriginal people from being a part of that. So the whole foundation of what this country is built on is the Constitution. And so there's been a lot of movements towards constitutional change to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution and to have a say in that. And then addressing the injustices that have taken place and stuff around land rights. So these are just broader social change things that could impact on increased participation and less disadvantage. Now, if we look at strategies to implement in the workplace, we can do things such as addressing discrimination and racism within the work organisation, so having a zero tolerance policy for racism. And that one can be really tricky because in Australia especially, there's a real tension. If you saw the movie that I attached to last week's lecture, which was The Australian Dream, we really struggle with talking about racism and even understanding what racism is. So we're going to talk about that in, I think, next week or the week after. So that's one way we can address some of the employment barriers for Aboriginal people. And employment programs are another one. So creating really interesting employment programs and supportive employment programs. So I've worked in 2 employment programs. One was where I worked in a non-Aboriginal organisation, and we partnered with an Aboriginal organisation, and then we recruited young Aboriginal people on a traineeship, and they could work for 6 months in the non-Aboriginal organisation and then go work 6 months in the Aboriginal organisation, and then at the end they could choose if they wanted to stay working in the Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal organisation. And this was a really great entry into the workforce because they got to experience the different contexts, but also complete I think it was a business traineeship that they were doing. But this is another one. So the one I'm going to share with you now is one that is quite special to me because this building that they now run a restaurant in on Gertrude Street, if you're in Melbourne, it's called Charcoal Lane. And it used to be the old Aboriginal Health Service, and so I spent a lot of years growing up there as a kid, and the health service moved further out and they turned the building into a really great employment program. So this employment program, I'm going to fast forward a little bit of this.
For example, with Charcoal Lane, who will be heavily involved in many events around the President's Cup, and the legacy of the
Mission Australia, when I dropped out of school, they sort of helped me out with getting into this place. The people here are really nice, easy to get along with. The social support people here have just helped me get into a restaurant up in Burke Street. When I finish Charcoal Lane, I'd like to continue my apprenticeship. Hopefully finish my apprenticeship.
Had some great successes actually. 70% of the kids who've come through this program have moved on to further employment in the hospitality trade.
I've been working here at Charcoal Lane since March of last year. I was doing front of house, and I was trying back of house as well. Working in the restaurant, through setting the tables, serving customers, also working behind the bar, making coffee and drinks. Here at Charcoal Lane we do life skills programs, so we do a lot of healthy nutrition, also sleep programs. When I finish at Charcoal Lane, I'd like to head to Uluru to do working up there at the river resort. I'd like to work at Uluru because of the area. Haven't really seen much of the Northern Territory, so it'd be awesome to go up and work there.
The partnership with Mission Australia has been incredibly successful for a number of reasons, but probably the most significant of which is the alignment of our objectives in terms of education and empowerment, because it's through those areas which we see as truly sustainable in terms of its impact on the communities which need it.
All of the applicants have different stories. They all come from different walks of life. We have lots of different ages, so our youngest participant in this current program is 16 and our oldest was 28. But for all of them too, there's been some difficulty in attaining mainstream employment or education, and so when they come here, there's not only the training that's offered, but there's 2 full-time youth support workers to help them deal with their social service issues as well.
This is one of the first jobs I did when I came here. It took me a couple of hours the first time. I could get it done in about, half an hour now. Everything's under control.
City staff have really embraced this partnership. They're very active in their support, whether that's volunteering their own personal time, donating gifts and toys, or financial contributions through our workplace giving program. I'm really very proud of our staff who have been incredibly dedicated and committed to the cause, and for partnering with Mission Australia to achieve some great outcomes.
Our involvement in the President's Cup, our involvement with Mission Australia is a truly exciting time, not just for the organisation.
Okay, so that was just a little example of a employment program, and that restaurant is actually a social enterprise business. So what it does is, if whatever money it makes, I think 70% of what it makes goes back into other employment programs to help other people get into employment. And so that's great because the person can be employed in that situation, but also get the social supports that they need to deal with the issues of why they haven't been able to access or stay in mainstream employment. So that's a really good example of one of the strategies that have been put in place to overcome workforce barriers for Aboriginal people. Education programs. Interesting one of the initiatives that I've seen is scholarships. Scholarships in different private schools. So they set up a program where especially those young people from remote communities could afford to come and get an education. There's a bit of conflict around that, and I've got I wonder if it's here. No. Yes. Okay, so this is the video that I want to show you about an education program which is about overcoming the barriers to employment through supporting people to access and attain education that can get them.
Revolution is to attempt to fix the problems in Indigenous communities. A range of alternatives are being looked at, including the controversial option of sending children to boarding schools in capital cities. A new program has been established in New South Wales, with big business paying the school fees for a group of Aboriginal girls. It's a program based on a successful model that's been running at Sydney's exclusive St Joseph's College for more than 5 years. But critics say it harks back to the days of the stolen generation. Richard Glanville reports.
Question task. 6 years ago, Craig Ashby rarely saw the inside of a classroom. Today, he's training to be a high school history teacher.
So on that little propaganda sheet,
I couldn't spell my address. I couldn't read at all. Could write my name. I think my writing was scribbled a lot, just the copy of what was on the board. And it was just scribbled. You wouldn't be able to read it if you tried to.
So if you get a source question in a school certificate?
When I first met Craig when I was 15, I wouldn't have thought that he would be in the position he is now, where he's a real leader for his people as a young Aboriginal person.
Craig Ashby grew up in the outback town of Walgett, 10 hours drive northwest of Sydney. He was raised by his grandmother and grew up in a small house with 3 other families. Getting an education was not a priority.
I didn't go to school at all. I used to wag most periods, just go and keep back on the oval and chat with my mates.
By the time Craig Ashby was 15, he decided he wanted more and discovered that some other boys from Walgett had won scholarships at St Joseph's College in Sydney, one of the country's most exclusive private schools.
They showed me their uniform and everything, and they were talking about Joey's, and I just thought it looked good in the uniform, so I went around to our priest and I just asked him could I go away, practically begged him, could he send me?
So what are the main arguments used?
6 years on, Craig Ashby has never looked back, and neither has the school. 44 Aboriginal boys from around New South Wales are now on full scholarships and have adjusted to boarding school life.
Okay guys, listen in please, everybody. Tonight is the last night of formal study before your half yearlies.
Over the past 5 years, 69 Aboriginal boys have taken part. Of that, 8 have left the school before completing their HSC. But the school says the boys are selected on the basis of financial need rather than academic or sporting ability.
It will change depending on their circumstances. Desire, absolutely want to be here. Their family, the reasons their family want them to be here, the views of their teachers in their current schools as to why they think this is a good option for them and not another option. All of those things weigh everybody does.
The St Joseph's model has worked so well that 4 Sydney girls' schools want to get involved.
So to all of you, a very warm welcome to St Vincent's for this very important occasion.
The Australian Indigenous Education Foundation has been set up to fund the schooling of Aboriginal girls. St Vincent's College in inner city Sydney is on board.
Historically, there's been a strong concern for Indigenous people and ensuring justice for those people. So it's part of the culture of our school to offer this.
St Joseph's old boy Andrew Penfold was an investment banker and lawyer who gave up his successful career to develop the program.
Different things work in different environments, and if there are children that want to go to schools like this, they should have that choice. They shouldn't be excluded from that choice or that opportunity of being able to go to those schools.
We undertake to do all in our power to advance the causes of reconciliation.
Jackie Gibbs, who's in Year 12, comes from Gadooga, a town with a population of 350 people in country New South Wales.
I was really afraid of public speaking. I hated it, and being with my teacher in my English class that helped me to become more in myself, self-esteem build up.
Up until now, her fees have been paid by the school, but it can now use money from the new foundation to educate another 20 students.
People just think that you change just because you've gone away to school, and it's not. We're still the little country girls from home, who love it. So we came away knowing that you can be whatever you want, especially coming from such a good school.
I wondered whether she would be able to stay because it seemed very daunting for her. But Jacqueline has just grown in stature and in confidence and in love of the school. She just loves the school.
Jackie Gibbs is looking forward to finishing school, travelling overseas, going on to university. Her family's admiration and support from her younger sister has made boarding school life a little easier.
They're really proud of us. It's really good to go home and hear we come home. My dad's always sitting on his little lounge. He's talking about school, and he's like, I just want you girls to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud of trying your hard at school. I know it's hard and difficult sometimes, but I'm really proud of you for staying in and doing this for us.
While this program model has many success stories, such as Jackie Gibbs and Craig Ashby, it's not without its critics.
Let's not pretend that this is the panacea, the thing that's going to fix everything in Indigenous education, because it really comes down to probably less than 2% who have any scope to access success or access any benefit from that kind of strategy.
What's the best way to do that?
Chris Sala is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Education Leadership Institute. He wants the federal government to build more schools in rural and regional areas so that children don't have to leave their communities to go to school.
In some circumstances, from some of the flash boarding schools, the culture of those places certainly are questionable. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend to anybody that that's not the case, that the culture of those elite schools are somewhat remote from those that children experience in communities. And there's a tendency not to stretch too much in those kinds of schools. It's either fit in or fare well.
Does taking Aboriginal children away from their communities hark back to the days of the stolen generation?
I think right now, I don't think we don't have a choice. We need to stand up and we need to make a stand against the problems within our communities. And whether it's a black person who's going to lead us or a white person, I think this is probably one of the best solutions of helping our kids.
Craig Ashby is now so sure that boarding schools can help provide a future for Indigenous children that he's out to convince the corporate world to donate to the new foundation.
And only up to year 10, I assume, was it?
The Australian Indigenous Education Foundation has attracted some of the country's most high-profile leaders. The scholarships don't receive any government funding, but as part of the Prime Minister's education revolution, this is one of the options being considered to help improve Indigenous education. Craig Ashby says he's proof it's possible and it can work.
I just want kids to not experience what I experienced as a kid and not make stupid mistakes, to take everything and stop playing this poor little Aboriginal game and start stepping up and become leaders and contributing to your people and your community.
Bridget Glanville with that report. For a longer version of the interview with Cardinal George Pell or...
Okay, so that's an example of one program that's quite controversial. Where did my PowerPoint's disappeared? It's a controversial idea, but